The biker slammed his fist on the counter and screamed, "You disrespectful little bitch!" He raised his hand, fast, hard, ready to land a vicious slap across her face. But before it could land, it stopped, caught midair. A hand had grabbed his wrist. The whole diner froze. He turned, ready to fight, and froze. Standing there, calm as stone, was Dan Blocker. No shouting, no panic, just one cold warning. You picked the wrong place. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and follow for more powerful stories that stay with you long after the credits roll. Now let's begin. When Dan Blocker retired from the screen, he didn't throw a party, write a memoir, or head for the hills with a film crew in tow. He bought a battered RV, pointed it west, and never looked back. These days, he kept his trailer parked behind a lonely truck stop at the edge of New Mexico, where the land stretched wide and the sky never shut up. Crossroads wasn't on any tourist map. It had one gas station, one diner, one sheriff, and more broken-down pickups than people. But it had peace, the kind Dan hadn't known in years. Out here, no one asked for autographs. Nobody cared who you used to be, so long as you were decent now. Every morning and every evening, he walked the same slow stretch from his trailer to Marlene's diner, wore the same brown coat, same dusty boots, and every time he came through the door, he'd slap the side of the jukebox and say, "Still not playing? Well, hell, guess I'll have to sing." And every time, folks would laugh. "Dan, don't you dare," Jenny would grin, coffee pot in hand. "Y'all lucky I'm in a good mood," he'd wink, sliding into his booth. He was like a part of the place, big and solid and worn smooth by time. He didn't say much unless he had something to say, but he listened. Folks liked that. Liked the way he remembered names, how he always said mornin' like it was the first word ever spoken. Marlene, the owner, was young, maybe 30. She'd taken over after her husband, Tommy, died in a crash just a month back. 7 months pregnant and still holding the place together with duct tape, grit, and pride. She smiled easy, but her eyes stayed tired. Dan always asked how she was, always made her laugh even when she didn't want to. The whole diner had a rhythm, and Dan had found his beat in it, until the road wolves came. They showed up late in the day, right when the sun was folding into the horizon and the sky looked like spilled gasoline set on fire. 2 of them, one tall and twitchy, all tattoos and grins. Snake. The other, thick-necked and mean-eyed. Hammer. They walked in like they were owed something. Dan looked up from his cup. He saw Marlene stiffen behind the counter. Hammer slapped his hands on the glass pie case. "You Marlene?" "That's right," she said, voice steady. "You owe us." She blinked. "Excuse me?" He grinned. "Protection dues. Road wolves keep this stretch clean, sweetheart. Ain't charity." Marlene stepped back just half an inch. "I never asked for your protection. Don't owe you a damn thing." Snake snorted. "Maybe you're forgetting what happened to that taco stand out in Camado." "Or Beth's gas station," Hammer added. Somebody tossed a match. Boom! Shame. Dan didn't move. His coffee steamed. Jenny leaned in close, whispering, "That's them. The ones I told you about. They've been going place to place, tearing through everything. Cops don't even try." "You listen to me," Marlene said, fire in her throat. "This place was built by my husband. Every screw, every booth. He died last month. You think I'm handing it over to a pair of dusty bastards who swagger in here thinking they're God's own hammer?" Snake chuckled. "She's got a mouth on her." Hammer didn't laugh. "You either pay up or you pay another way." Dan's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Snake wandered off toward the booths. When he passed old Carl, he spat. A thick, disgusting glob that hit the old man's sleeve. Then he grabbed Carl's plate, flipped it, and dumped scrambled eggs and bacon into his lap. Carl just looked down, shaking. "Oops," he said, grinning. Jenny rushed over, but Dan caught her wrist gently and shook his head. "Not yet." Hammer reached across the counter, crushing over a sugar jar. You sure you don't want to rethink this? I said no. And then he reached for her, fast, rough, hand curling toward her belly. Dan moved. It was like watching a bear rise. 1 second he was in the booth, the next his hand locked around Hammer's wrist mid-reach. I'd take that hand off her if I were you, Dan said, voice low and cold. Hammer yanked back. The hell are you? Snake squinted. Shit. I know that face. You're that guy. From the TV show. What was it? Ranch Law? Prairie? Something? Snake clicked his fingers. Dan Blocker. Ain't you dead? Not yet, Dan said. Hammer sneered. What's a washed-up actor doing out here in the sticks? Drinking coffee, minding his business. Until you two made that real hard to do. Hammer stepped forward. You trying to be the hero, cowboy? Dan met his eyes. I've played one long enough. Maybe it stuck. Snake chuckled. What are you gonna do, old man? Recite a monologue? Wave your Emmy at us? Dan didn't flinch. Maybe, but I still know the difference between a man and a mutt. Hammer's face twisted. You son of a... He swung. Dan caught his wrist again, turned it, and drove his elbow into Hammer's ribs. Snake rushed forward. Dan stepped aside, grabbed the back of Snake's jacket, and slammed him against the counter. Hammer threw a wild punch. Dan ducked and sent a boot to the back of his knee. The man collapsed. Snake grabbed a salt shaker and swung. Dan caught his arm, twisted it, and shoved him face first onto a table. Dan grabbed the bigger man by the collar, slammed him into the wall hard enough to rattle the sugar canisters. Snake charged, wild and sloppy. Dan sidestepped, let him trip over a stool, then kicked it out from under him. The whole thing lasted less than a minute. Both men ended up on the floor, groaning, dazed, humiliated. Dan adjusted his coat. Hammer wiped blood from his lip. This ain't over, you son of a bitch. We're coming back, with the pack. Snake limped toward the door, glaring at Marlene. You should have paid up. Get out, Dan said. They crawled to their feet, stumbled out the door. They staggered outside, started up a battered motorcycle, and disappeared into the dusk. Inside, the silence was heavy. Dan walked to the counter. Marlene stood there, arms shaking. Hanto holed everything in. This diner, she whispered, is all I've got. Dan said nothing. My husband, she continued, voice breaking. He built it. He was it. He's gone. And I've got nothing left but this place. And this baby. I ain't got backup. I ain't got family. If they come back... She looked up at Dan, tears fighting past her anger. I can't do this. If they came back, they would burn this diner. Dan didn't speak right away. He looked around the diner, at the overturned table, the broken salt shaker, the spilled coffee, then at her. You're not alone. She shook her head. They'll come back. He nodded. Then so will I. Dan looked her in the eyes. Because there's still some things worth standing for. And this place, this right here, it's one of them. Outside, the wind picked up. The jukebox crackled, almost like it might come to life again. And Dan Blocker, the man the world thought retired, sat down at his booth, finished his cold coffee, and waited for what came next. That night, long after the last truck had pulled out and the diner's neon sign had given up the fight with the wind, Dan sat alone in his RV with nothing but the sound of coyotes howling somewhere past the dark. The desert stretched out quiet and cold around him, but in his chest there was a stirring, something old waking up. He reached into the little cabinet above the sink and pulled out an old flip phone, the kind no one used anymore, unless they didn't want to be found. He opened it slow, thumb hovering over the keypad. One by one, he started dialing. The first call went to Big Steve, a trucker now, but once a Marine back in the day. You ever mean it? Steve once told him. I'll still be there. The second went to Doc Wilson, former Army medic, now driving freight through New Mexico, a man who knew how to patch holes and hold the line. Next was Carlito Reyes, retired sheriff from Arizona, sharp as ever, who owed Dan a favor from a night outside Tucson they both agreed not to speak about. Then Pete Knuckles Harlan, ex-stuntman, ex-con, ex-too damn many things. Now he lived in a cabin with too many dogs and not enough reason to care. Until he heard Dan's voice. Dan didn't say much to any of them, just the same words, low and firm. "I need your help." Each one answered in their own way, but all of they are on their way. He closed the phone, leaned back in the old creaky chair, and stared at the ceiling. Out there in the dark, something mean was circling, but he wouldn't be facing it alone. Not this time. The desert was different in the morning. Quiet, yes, but not peaceful. The kind of silence that made a man listen closer, not lean back. The wind had a grit to it, and the sunrise over crossroads came with long, low shadows that made every shape a little more uncertain. Dan Blocker was already up when the sun cracked the edge of the land. By 7:30, the diner's parking lot had more dust trails than a cattle drive. A beat-up Kenworth rolled in first, then a Dodge with rusted sides, an old Crown Vic, a motorcycle with saddlebags stitched shut with bungee cords. They didn't come in a pack, didn't even look like they were together. But Dan recognized every one of them. They came in quiet. Big Steve was first through the door, still had shoulders like a barn door and a belly like a keg. He didn't say a word, just tipped his cap, walked up to the counter and laid down a 20. Doc Wilson followed, thinner now, a touch gray, but eyes sharp like a man who'd seen blood from both sides. Carlito Reyes, tall and straight despite 2 gunshot scars and a limp. Pete Knuckles Harlan, wearing a denim jacket over prison tattoos, nodding like he'd just stepped back into his role from a long-forgotten scene. They came in, ordered coffee, and sat without fuss. No handshakes, no speeches, just a quiet glance at Dan, a small nod, like an old crew back on a familiar set. Marlene noticed, of course. She gave Dan a look, somewhere between thank you and what the hell's happening. Dan just said, "They're friends." Sheriff Cooper showed up around 9. His cruiser rattled more than it should, and he walked with the slow step of a man who'd spent too many years on back roads chasing bad decisions. He slid into the booth across from Dan and stirred sugar into his coffee before speaking. "You called him in," he said flat. Dan didn't answer right away. He waited for the diner to settle again. "They came on their own," he said finally. "I just opened the door." Cooper sipped. "Road wolves won't like this." They didn't like being told no last night either. "They'll be back. Probably more of them. Not just wolves either. Word is they're tied to some bigger outfit, Southern cartel types, using truck routes and way stations for distribution. Quiet, organized." Dan nodded. "Crossroads is in their way." "Exactly. You hold this place, you screw up the route, and they don't take kindly to that." Dan looked out the window. The sun had burned through most of the dust now. The place looked normal, but it wasn't. "They made it personal when they put hands on her," he said. Cooper sighed, long and tired. "I've got 2 deputies. One's out sick. The other's 24 and can't shoot straight when it counts." Dan's eyes didn't leave the window. "Then don't waste them. Let us handle the mess. You keep the paperwork clean." Cooper didn't argue. At 11:30, the wolves came back. 6 this time. 2 bikes, 2 trucks, a souped-up SUV. Same jackets, same sneers, but this time they parked wide, like they were staging something. Dan stepped out onto the front porch of the diner before they even opened the doors. Big Steve followed, leaned against the rail. Doc Wilson stood in the open doorway, arms crossed. Inside, Pete sat at the counter like he'd always belonged there. Hands still, but eyes never still. The wolves hesitated. Hammer was back. A busted lip and bruised cheek didn't help his attitude. Snake, too, though he kept behind the others. They were flanked now by new muscle. Heavier guys, quieter, eyes scanning every angle. Y'all gathering for a senior citizen protest? Hammer said, stepping forward. This your army blocker? Dan didn't reply. Snake smirked. Guess the retirement community's getting frisky. Dan took one step off the porch, hands in his coat pockets. His voice was calm. You boys came here looking to rattle folks. You did. But now you're rattling the wrong cage. There's nothing here for you. Hammer raised his chin. You don't get to decide that. I just did, Dan said. The wolves stared for a beat longer. The silence wasn't just tension. It was calculation. They weren't used to being met with a wall. Hammer spat near Dan's boot. This ain't over. Then, as quick as they came, they turned and left. But nobody in the diner thought they were retreating. Dan walked back inside. The place stayed quiet, but it wasn't scared anymore. It was listening. That afternoon, they got to work. Pete and Steve scoped out the perimeter. Carlito walked the edge of the property, flagged weak spots in the lot and fence lines. Doc Wilson inventoried first aid supplies, old med kits, bottled water. Sheriff Cooper started photocopying reports, license plates, old incidents that could tie road wolves to anything actionable. Dan coordinated it all from a corner booth, like a man stitching a quilt of quiet defiance. Marlene brought coffee. She didn't say much, but her hands didn't shake anymore. Jenny helped reinforce the diner's back door with 2x4s and old hinges Steve pulled from his truck. The locals, a few old-timers, some younger ranch hands, even a couple Navajo boys from the trading post, started trickling in. They didn't ask what was going on. They just looked around, nodded, and picked up tools. Nobody called it a fight, but everybody knew one was coming. By the end of the week, Crossroads didn't look like a town. It looked like a checkpoint, a place where something had happened or was about to. Pete ran cables for cameras, old security systems he'd pulled from an abandoned truck yard. Steve built makeshift barricades out of spare tires, scrap metal, and concrete blocks left over from a collapsed gas station. The fencing got higher, thicker. Someone painted a wolf skull on a piece of sheet metal and hung it upside down at the edge of the parking lot. Dan didn't say much. He just watched, directed. Not like a boss, more like a man laying tracks while the train's already on its way. At night, they sat in the diner, going over maps. They marked entry points, escape routes, hiding spots. Doc had a list of everyone with medical skills. Sheriff Cooper started reaching out, quiet calls to old deputies, friends from other counties. Road wolves didn't sit still. They sent feelers, testers. 2 strangers in a pickup who came through asking questions, left without ordering food. A delivery truck driver who lingered too long at the pumps. Someone cut the phone line behind the diner one night, but Steve had already rigged a backup. It wasn't war, not yet. It was pressure, heat. They were feeling the fence. Dan knew this kind of fight, not from his time on screen, but from the times between the takes. Long days in towns where nobody trusted outsiders. Late nights with crew members who'd seen too much, lost too much, kept too quiet. He knew how the real wolves moved. Dan walked the perimeter every night, sometimes alone, sometimes with Steve, sometimes with just the moon for company. The town didn't sleep much anymore. Jenny got a threatening note under her door. Beth's son came home one evening to find their dog poisoned. Cooper's cruiser got its tires slashed in the school parking lot. Dan didn't say a word about it. He just kept walking. Each step was a line drawn in the dirt. Each camera, each nail, each screw, a quiet answer to the noise that was coming. The night they came back was colder than usual. A wind rolled off the highway, low and biting, like it carried something mean with it. Folks in Crossroads had learned to sleep light lately. That night, most didn't sleep at all. Inside the diner, the lights were dim. Jenny stood behind the counter, wiping down mugs that were already clean. Steve was at a booth by the door, reading a map he didn't need to look at. Marlene sat in the back, one hand on her stomach, the other wrapped tight around a cup of cold tea. Dan was outside. He stood in the shadow of the old neon sign, watching dust stir down the road. The desert always gave warning, but only to those who knew how to read it. By the time the wolves' engines broke the silence, Dan had already slipped his phone back in his pocket. He'd sent the last message 10 minutes earlier. Ready. The headlights appeared first. 4 bikes, 1 pickup, 1 windowless van. No horns, no yelling, just rumbling, slow as a funeral, right up to the edge of the lot. They didn't expect resistance. Not tonight. Not from a diner held together by grit and plywood. The wolves came out loud. Hammer led, wearing a new jacket and a bigger chip on his shoulder. Snake flanked him, alongside a new batch of muscle. 5 of them, maybe 6, spread out across the lot like they owned it. They fanned out, walking slow, scanning. "Hope y'all made coffee," Hammer called. Dan didn't speak. He stayed right where they could see him, just inside the circle of light from the diner's flickering sign. "We figured maybe last time got off on the wrong foot," Hammer went on, smiling that greasy grin. "Figured we'd come back friendly, reintroduce ourselves, maybe toss a few things around." Dan didn't move. Snake chuckled and kicked over a trash can. Another one pulled the mirror off a parked car. Someone else smashed a flashlight into a vending machine. And that's when one of them headed for the diner door. He didn't get there. The second his boot hit the porch step, the floodlights kicked on. Bright, blinding. The wolves froze. For a breath, maybe 2. It was dead quiet. Then came the sound of boots from both sides. Steve stepped out from behind a shed with a crowbar in hand. Doc Wilson emerged from the alley with a tire iron. Carlito, from behind a propane tank, holding a shotgun he'd retired with 15 years ago. From the diner itself, Pete stepped out the back, calm as Sunday, holding a piece of steel pipe like it was part of his arm. They surrounded them without a word, one long, slow circle of men who didn't need to shout to make a point. Hammer turned. "What the hell is this?" Dan finally spoke. "Last warning." "Or what?" Snake laughed. "You gonna call your agent?" Dan stepped forward. "I ain't the one surrounded." Hammer looked around again, slower this time. He saw how close the men were, saw the angles, the quiet, the readiness. One of his boys made the mistake of lunging. Pete dropped him in 2 moves, quick, sharp, efficient. Then everything moved fast. Steve cracked a bat across another's shin. Doc tackled one into a post. Carlito raised his shotgun and didn't need to fire. Just the sound of it racking made the rest freeze. In less than a minute, it was done. The wolves were face down or limping. Hammer stood alone, fists clenched, breath ragged. Snake had blood in his mouth. Dan walked up to him, slow. "You think this place is weak because it's quiet. You think these people don't fight because they don't bark back. But you're wrong." Hammer sneered. "You're all dead men." Dan leaned in. "Then you better send better men." Behind him, Cooper's cruiser lights flashed into view. No siren, just presence. The law had come, and he wasn't empty-handed. Deputies behind him. Not much, but enough. 2 of the wolves were cuffed on the spot. The others were dragged back to their bikes and trucks and told not to stop till they hit the county line. Snake, bruised, spit-covered, and rattled, was one of the ones caught. And Snake, unlike his name, didn't stay quiet. The next morning, after a few hours in the holding cell, he gave up a name, Ramirez. Sheriff Cooper said it first, holding the report in his hands. "Diego goddamn Ramirez." Dan stood next to him in the office, arms crossed. "Name mean anything to you?" Cooper asked. Dan nodded once. "Used to move people. Now he moves drugs. DEA had him on their radar. He didn't move the drugs himself. He moved the people who moved them. He ran logistics like a CEO. He'd started with coyotes, then cars, then trucks." Dan looked out the window. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that didn't mean rain, just less light. "Let's finish this," he said. And so they began. Dan and Cooper started logging everything, every unfamiliar vehicle, every call from blocked numbers, every supply shipment delayed or turned away. They tapped into old contacts. Dan reached out to a producer friend in Phoenix with ties to a former DEA liaison. Cooper dusted off files he hadn't touched in years. They didn't tell the town. Not everything. Not yet. The bait was set. Ramirez didn't hit back with bullets. He used business cards. 2 days after the takedown, Beth's loan was flagged at the bank. A clerical review. Then, suddenly, a lien. Something about missing documents, backdated penalties. She hadn't missed a payment in years. At the same time, the gas station's fuel delivery was canceled without warning. Logistical backlog, the dispatcher said. But others got theirs just fine. Jenny's mother, in home care upstate, got a call. "We've reviewed your file. Coverage may lapse." Sheriff Cooper got a letter offering his son a job with Homeland Security. High pay, relocation to Arizona, all off the books. Nobody said Ramirez's name, but everyone knew it. Marlene found a flyer on her windshield. Big red letters. Close shop or bury family. Dan took the flyer, didn't even frown. He burned it in a metal coffee can behind the diner, watched it turn to ash. But the pressure worked. Some folks stopped showing up. Others hesitated. The trucks grew fewer. Travelers passed by. It wasn't bullets, but it was war. Dan called it the quiet choke. Squeeze from the sides. No mess. Just slow death. That's when Pete suggested they fight quiet with quiet. They started collecting, not confronting. Camera footage, phone numbers, license plates. A pattern started to emerge. Vehicles tied to shell companies, names linked to past logistics hubs. A few tied directly to Ramirez's shell corporations. Dan knew the paper trail. He followed it like a script. By now, Ramirez likely knew someone was watching, so he doubled down. Beth's son was jumped behind the supermarket. Just bruises. A warning. Jenny got a text at 2 a.m., a picture of her mom's house. Then a second. Her own house. Cooper's dog was poisoned. Quiet. No footprints. No cameras. Dan sat Marlene down. "We're not folding," he told her. Her voice shook. "They know where I sleep." "I know," he said. "And they want you to break before they do. But we're just a truck stop." Dan leaned back. "Not anymore." They started sending the evidence out, quietly, bit by bit, to the state troopers, to DEA, to a senator's assistant in Santa Fe who owed Cooper a favor. Every log, every photo, every whisper. The town stayed silent, but the net was tightening, and Ramirez didn't know just how close he already stood to the edge. The night it happened, the lights died without warning. It wasn't just the diner. The entire grid on the south edge of Crossroads went black. No hum from the gas station pumps. No flicker from the streetlight that leaned sideways near the post office. The wind stopped too, like even it was holding its breath. Dan Blocker stood outside the RV, looking up at the dark. He didn't panic, didn't move. He just watched. Across the road, the men were already slipping into position. Steve in the mechanic's pit with the breaker box. Doc crouched behind the propane tanks with the radio. Pete sat in the diner's back hallway, leaning against the wall, legs stretched out like he was waiting on coffee. Every man in Crossroads who had stayed knew this was coming. They didn't know when. But Ramirez had given them 24 hours. And it was hour 24, right on the tick. The first sound came low, a distant rumble, like a dust storm building from far off. But this wasn't wind. This was engines. Dozens of them, growling like wolves in a long, hungry line. Jenny locked the diner door behind her. She didn't scream or shake. She just moved to Marlene's side, one hand resting on her shoulder, the other gripping the Louisville slugger bat Dan had leaned against the wall 2 nights ago. Marlene didn't say a word. She just stood there, round with child and carved from steel, eyes fixed on the windows. The vehicles came in waves. 2 black SUVs first, slow and tight. Then bikes. Then trucks, big guttural rigs with blacked-out windows. When the count hit 20, the town was surrounded. Over 100 men, maybe more. The wolves were just the front. Behind them came others. Different tattoos, different walk, different smell. These were hired. Not from here. Maybe not even from this country. Dan stood under the dead streetlight. His coat moved slightly in the wind that had finally come back. The lead SUV rolled to a stop 10 feet from him. The doors didn't open right away. Then, slowly, the back passenger door swung out. Diego Ramirez stepped out like he was stepping onto a film set. Alligator boots, creased pants, dark vest, and eyes like cold marble. He looked at Dan like a man inspecting an animal in a trap. "This is cute," Ramirez said. "Very American." Dan didn't respond. Ramirez smiled and gestured at the town. "You think you've done something smart here, old man?" Dan finally spoke. "You brought a lot of men to threaten a diner." "This isn't about a diner," Ramirez said. "It's about control." He stepped closer. "You're in the way. And you can walk now. Quiet. Clean. I'll even make you rich for it. $3 million. Tax-free. Cash. Just pack up your little band of cowboys and disappear." "And if I say no?" Ramirez gave a mock sigh. "Then you'll be buried beneath the very dust you're so fond of walking on." Behind him, the wolves started moving. Hammer was back, eyes bloodshot, vest tight. Snake stood near the edge of the group, trying not to look directly at Dan. Men broke off in pairs and trios, heading toward buildings, alleyways, fences. 2 headed for the back of the diner. 1 kicked over a bench outside the sheriff's station. Ramirez leaned close. "You can't win. Not this time. This is bigger than you." Dan looked him in the eye. "I'm not trying to win." That gave Ramirez pause. "Then what are you doing?" Dan took a slow breath. "Holding the line." It happened fast after that. One of the wolves smashed through the diner's side door. Another yanked open the gas station's back gate. A third shattered a car window just for the noise of it. And then the lights came back. All of them. Floodlights, halogens, generators humming to life. A white blaze of light poured over the entire lot, flooding the faces of the wolves and cartel mercs like they'd stepped into heaven or hell, depending on your lean. And from every angle, they came out. Not just Steve, Pete, and Doc, not just Cooper and his deputies. FBI agents in tactical gear, DEA officers behind unmarked vans. They'd been waiting, hiding, watching. The moment Ramirez's men started breaking property lines, probable cause, the net snapped shut. Flashbangs cracked in alleys. Voices shouted from rooftops. Armed men stepped from inside sheds, out of parked trailers, from behind dumpsters. The wolves panicked. Some ran, some pulled weapons, but they didn't get far. Cooper tackled one with his bare hands. Pete took down a man twice his size with a pipe and a grunt. Steve helped pin Hammer against the hood of a police truck. Snake froze. He tried to run, and was caught before he hit the corner. Ramirez didn't move. He stood perfectly still, staring at Dan like the world had lied to him. "You set me up," he said. Dan took a slow step forward. "You set yourself up. You think this changes anything?" Dan tilted his head. "I do." An agent cuffed Ramirez. "You'll be dead in a week," Ramirez hissed. "You don't get to walk away from this." Dan met his stare with steady calm. "I already walked away. Now I just stand. That's enough." And then it was over. They worked all night through sunrise. By the time the sun broke the horizon, over 100 men had been arrested. Wolves, cartel operatives, drivers, bagmen, and brokers. Weapons recovered. Drugs found in the trucks. Under the seats, in the walls, inside fake fire extinguishers, computers, flash drives, burner phones, all loaded with names, numbers, routes. Ramirez didn't say another word, but his files spoke plenty. By noon, Crossroads was swarming with federal agents. News vans showed up around 3. Someone coined a name for it on Twitter, Operation Crossroads, and it stuck. Sheriff Cooper gave a short statement to the press. This wasn't just a bar fight or a gang scrap. This was a coordinated takedown of one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking rings in the American Southwest. They said it spread through 3 states, that Ramirez had at least 15 fronts, a dozen safe houses, 5 county officers on payroll. Dan didn't go on camera. He sat in the booth by the window, same as always, sipping coffee that Jenny poured without being asked. Beth brought pie. Steve sat on the edge of the bar, arms crossed, eyes soft for once. Pete fixed the broken hinge on the diner's back door. Doc Wilson patched up bruises, stitched a few heads, said it was the quietest war he'd ever been in. Every person who stayed got credit. Jenny, who didn't flinch, Marlene, who never ran, Steve, who stood guard every damn night, Beth, who kept the lights on, even Carl, who barked into a walkie like it still worked, just to make noise. The town didn't cheer, didn't party, but they stood taller. Dan finished his coffee and looked around. Same chairs, same floor, same cracked sugar dispensers. But something was different. Something solid now. He went outside. The air was clean again. No exhaust, no fear. Cooper stood by the cruiser, dog leash in hand, a new puppy already chewing his boot. "You didn't have to stay," Cooper said. "I know," Dan answered. "You think it's over?" Dan looked at the road. "No, but it's quieter now." And that was enough for him. He sat back in his spot. Didn't say much the rest of the day, but folks came by, nodded, left pie, patted his shoulder. Even Snake's cousin, who owned a muffler shop, offered to fix his RV free of charge. "You did right by this place," he said. Dan didn't answer, just raised his cup in a silent toast. 3 days after the last shot, Crossroads came back to life. Not with ceremony or speeches, and not all at once. But it came back, steady and real, like a town shaking off a long, hard storm. The sound of hammers tapping replaced the echo of gunfire. Wood went up over shattered glass. Paint rollers smoothed out the bullet holes. Someone fixed the jukebox. It still didn't play, but it lit up again. That was enough. The gas station had power by noon. The diner had half its windows boarded up, but the coffee still flowed. Jenny was back behind the counter, pouring cups without being asked. Doc Wilson sat near the end of the bar with a bruise on his jaw and a crossword he couldn't finish. Beth was out front repainting the sign. Dan came in around 8, same as always. Coat a little dusty, boots a little scuffed. But his eyes were steady. "Morning, Mr. Blocker," Jenny said, her voice soft like sunrise. "Jenny," he replied, taking his usual spot by the window. The view hadn't changed much. The lot still had cracked pavement. One of the light poles leaned at an angle. There was a tire mark scorched into the dirt that probably wouldn't fade for a while, but everything else was still there, and that mattered more. Folks came in and out that morning. Ranchers, truckers, a school teacher from a nearby town who'd brought homemade bread. Nobody said much about the raid. They didn't have to. The whole place carried the weight of it, but also something else. A kind of pride that didn't show up on banners or headlines. Crossroads had been a stop, a dot on the map, a forgettable place between here and there. But now, it meant something. It stood for something. By the 4th day, federal charges were already filed. The name Diego Ramirez ran across news tickers from Albuquerque to D.C. He faced more than a dozen federal counts: drug trafficking, conspiracy, weapons charges, and murder for hire. His operation, according to the DEA, spanned across at least 3 states and tied in with cartel networks running up through the border. The road wolves? Scattered. Some ran, some got caught. Others just disappeared like dust on a hard wind. But none returned to Crossroads. What started as a local standoff became a national story. They called it a grassroots resistance. The headlines liked that phrase. Reporters asked for quotes. Cameras showed up. A few producers sniffed around, asking about movie rights. Dan didn't speak to any of them. He just kept coming to the diner, sat at the same booth, sipped his coffee, nodded to folks. Sometimes he'd walk the edge of town, checking the fencing that was still half standing. Sometimes he'd just sit and watch the sky. When Cooper asked him if he'd accept a medal, some official recognition from the governor's office, Dan shook his head once. "Not why I stayed," he said. Cooper didn't press. That afternoon, a letter arrived from a group of independent truckers out of Colorado. Said they'd heard what happened. Said they were organizing. Said Crossroads gave them courage. Next came a message from a widow in Texas who ran a pit stop on her own. Said she chased off 2 men with road wolves tattoos after reading the news. Said she'd never let fear get in first again. By the end of the week, folks from other towns started showing up. Not tourists, not thrill seekers, just regular people wanting to shake a hand, drop off tools, offer help. They didn't need thanks. They just needed to know somebody had stood up and it hadn't ended in ashes. That was the legacy. Not the fight, but the fact that Crossroads was still standing. Marlene reopened full service on day 6. Her apron barely fit over her belly anymore, but she insisted on working. When someone asked why she didn't rest, she smiled and said, "I did my resting when they thought I was breakable." Nobody argued. Jenny started organizing shelves again. Steve fixed the back lock that had never worked right. Pete offered to teach self-defense classes in the lot behind the diner. Doc said he'd stay a little longer just in case folks needed tending. Cooper finally slept through a full night, first time in weeks. And Dan? Dan sat with his coffee, like he had before the storm came. But this time, he wasn't alone in it. People came by more often, not to ask things of him, not to praise or question, but just to sit, share space, say a few words. And when silence came, which it always did, they let it hang in the air without needing to fill it. That's how folks like Dan liked it best. One evening, around sunset, Beth sat across from him, her hair tied back, arms dusted with flour. She looked out the window and said, "It's strange." Dan didn't look up from his coffee. "What's that?" "How we got here. One minute we were serving pie and fixing hoses. Next thing you know, we're on the news. Some kinda symbol." Dan exhaled through his nose, slow. "Funny thing about symbols, they don't mean nothing till somebody puts weight behind them." "You think folks will remember?" Dan looked up at her then, not smiling, not frowning either, just real steady. "They'll remember what they need to." Beth nodded, didn't ask anything else, and maybe that was the point. What happened in Crossroads wasn't loud, not in the way the world usually measured things. It wasn't flashy or quick. It took time. It took patience. It took people saying no and meaning it again and again until those words became walls. Dan knew the next threat might not wear leather or carry guns. It might come in papers, in suits, in offers that sounded too good to be trouble. But he also knew one other thing. When the time came, this town would answer. Not because they were heroes, but because they'd already seen what silence could cost. As the sky darkened and the first stars blinked in, Dan finished his coffee and leaned back in the booth. The hum of the diner, the smell of bacon grease, the clink of cups and silverware. It was all still here. Maybe that was victory, not in what they'd stopped, but in what they'd kept. All right, folks, before we wrap this video, I just want to take a quiet moment to talk heart to heart, not as a narrator or storyteller, but just one person to another. This story hit different. Crossroads wasn't just about bikers, guns, or action. It was about what happens when good people draw the line and say, no more. It was about a man named Dan Blocker, a name some of y'all might remember from old westerns, who could have stayed quiet, could have looked the other way, but he didn't. Dan didn't fight because he had to. He fought because it was right. Because somebody needed to stand up, not with speeches or a badge, but with quiet strength and an unshakable sense of decency. That's rare. That's powerful. That's the kind of man who changes everything without asking for credit. And that diner? That tiny town? It stood because one man's courage became everybody's courage. There's a deep humanity in this story. It reminds us that heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear worn-out boots, carry coffee instead of guns, and just refuse to let fear win. It reminds us that community matters, that ordinary folks can do extraordinary things, and that sometimes resistance looks like staying put when the world tells you to run. If this story meant something to you, like it did to me, drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. What would you have done in Dan's place? What would your crossroads moment look like? And if you think the world needs more stories like this, stick around. See y'all in the next one.